4, 3,
2,
2, 1. We are live. Olá, bom dia, boa tarde.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. My name is William de Castro. I'm a researcher and a master's degree student at the POSAFRO-UFBA and a curator of the Afro-Digital Museum. And I'm here to salute you and welcome you for the second round of lives of the 21st Doctoral School Factory of Ideas. This is an intensive school that is in the calendar of several researchers all over the globe. This edition that happens every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 a.m. Brazilian time, counting on 30 doctoral professors from all over the world. I would like to take the opportunity to remind you that next week we are going to have a live on Tuesday first, and then on Thursday it will be a holiday. We won't have classes. It's a holiday in Brazil. Fabricadeideias organizes this event in partnership with the Graduate Studies program in Ethnic and African Studies at the Federal University of Bahia. Professor Yacuba, perhaps if you could shut down your microphone, please. And the Federal University of Campinas, and the Program and Public Policies of the Federal University of Maranhão, and the African Multiple Cluster of Excellence at Universidade Beirut. As much as the whole team is organizing the Fabrica and the factory, thank you. This event counts on the support of the University of Cape Verde, the Pro-Director of Extension of the Federal University of Bahia, the Brazilian Association of National Association of Graduate Studies in Social Sciences, the Brazilian Association of Political Science, and Brazilian Association of Sociology. This event is made possible by AGS9 Communication in Diversity and translated by Professor Raquel de Souza. All of those involved, thank you, and thank you to all of you who are attending these lectures and participating and sharing your time with us. Your attendance rates need to be 75% at least in order to receive a certification, and please make sure that you stay focused on the issues at stake in this panel in order to provide questions, and so that we can avoid generalizations and we can exchange information on such complex issues.
Das fake news, jornalismo.
The panel today will be managed by Natuíde Salvador and Professor Manuel de Oliveira. The debater is going to be Professor Jamile Costa, to whom I thank in advance for being here and sharing your knowledge with us, so that we can think together and ponder, reflect about such drastic moments we are living in. Professor Natuíde is a doctoral
Sociedade, também pela Universidade de Nottingham. É mestre em pesquisa em sociologia, com especialidade em sociologia pela Universidade Cheikh Anta Diop, no Senegal.
He's got a master's degree by the Cheikh Anta Diop University and University of Joseph Kizebo in Burkina Faso. He is an assistant professor of sociology at he's a member of the Session of Knowledge and Research and Excellence for African Studies. He's also a part of this excellence pole of the Bayreuth. His interests in research themes are in the area of historical sociology, human sciences in Africa, knowledge, powers and societies, knowledge and moral, knowledge and technologies of circulation, global sociology, general health, collaborations in scientific cooperation, regionally and internationally. So I would like to introduce you, Professor
Recording in progress.
Dr. Sawadogo.
Excuse me, Professor. I'm going to ask you to turn off your video, please. Turn on your video. I'm sorry.
Professor?
Are you there?
Professor, yes, please. So we have just introduced you, so we are waiting for you.
So we all can see you.
We would like you to turn on your camera. Thank you.
We can see you now. So
Professor, before I start interpreting you from English to Portuguese, I would like to remind you that you pace yourself. Can you hear me?
Can I share my, do you like this, or can I share my PowerPoint? Do you want me to just go on with this way? Okay, so thank you very much. I'm pleased to...
Excuse me, I believe you can share your screen right now. Already.
Okay.
Thank you.
Share
Excuse me.
this.
Professor, can you hear me?
Thank you. This is a pleasure for me to...
Agradeço. Hoje é um grande prazer para mim para participar desta reunião.
The first time
Essa é a primeira vez que eu estou participando deste evento e da fábrica de ideias, e realmente eu quero colocar aqui, oferecer essas ideias para o fábrica que eu tenho desenvolvido agora por já um ano, após o anúncio da pandemia de Covid-19.
of emergency, professionalism, and the fight against COVID-19 in Burkina Faso. My presentation will, first, I will give an overview of the states around the COVID-19 fighting in the country, in Burkina Faso. And the second one, I will discuss the ideas and the approaches about the professionalism. And at the first stage, I will reflect on the role of professions as a powerful professional body in the context of crisis, how these professions contribute to changes, to major changes in the interest of the public. So to start on, as you know, the COVID-19 is a global respiratory disease that appeared in December 2019 in the city of Wuhan in China. And Burkina Faso registers its first case on March the 10th, 2020. Right after that, the country, as you can see, for the first 6 months, the numbers of cases have been rising from less than 200 to up to 400 or around 600 cases in September. It shows the threat of crisis that this country has been undergoing like other countries. And immediately, if you take the first 6 months, you have 2,481 cases, among which you have 77 deaths and 2,322 covered. For a country like Burkina Faso, 65 deaths is really a major problem because of the fear, because of the what this can escalate in the country, in the developing country like Burkina Faso. So, in a way that immediately in March, from March, the government take a number of measures. These measures include the state of emergency. And the state of emergency, as you know, is the context in which the government concentrates all the powers at its disposal to bring orders in the nation. And yes, this is a very key context in terms of looking for the right means, the right measure to tackle the crisis. And looking for measures includes anything that can bring orders in the country. For me, as researchers, in the context where there is no medicine, there is no therapeutic measure, every source of knowledge would be grateful for the country. So I'm wondering, in this context, where traditional healers, indigenous knowledge about medicine, what is the contribution, or what could be the contribution of these professionals in the fight against the COVID? And here is really, as I say, from a human point of view, this toll is very heavy, but history teaches us about the many phases of crisis. The catastrophic phase for some, but a positive phase for others. In other words, a defunctionalization for some and a functionalization for others. It is, for example, indigenous disease assistance in colonial West Africa was born following pandemics that ravaged Europeans. It means that catastrophic context can bring innovation, can bring changes, can bring new things that can leverage some of the suffering of the population. So in this context, African doctors have occupied health posts, which is first reserved. This is first allocated to European doctors. It means that without these epidemics in colonial context, indigenous doctors will never ever reach this prestigious post. This example I give to show you how catastrophic situation like this crisis around the COVID could have been a context for change, a context for innovation, a context for new knowledge production, a context for mobility in social terms of some people who were defunctionalized, particularly in the health sector. So this is a chart that I would like you to view and appreciate the role of crisis in innovation. This bar is the context, and these arrows are showing the context of crisis. And these arrows below here are the context of new ideas, which are taking advantage of the crisis to be, bring them to be brought on surface and become a dominant knowledge paradigm. This is a schematic presentation of how situation of crisis can allow marginal ideas to become dominant ideas. And from a sociological point of view, I was saying the COVID context as a situation that would allow indigenous medicine and knowledge techniques to become part of the candidates, part of the new knowledge which would be considered in the fight of this pandemic. But as an observer of this context, I observed that unfortunately these traditional practitioners haven't been able, these arrows are showing that instead of this knowledge going up and replace these defunctionalized medical knowledge, which is not able to fight against the COVID, is going down because the division of the new knowledge, the division of the marginal knowledge did not happen. It did not happen. Why this did not happen? In the context where people have been looking for solutions, have been looking for any solution, including the state taking emergency situation measures to bring orders. So the question is why the traditional healers, why the other competing knowledge haven't been able to reach this context of discussion in order to be a part of this new knowledge that could be used to fight the COVID. And in order to understand this context, I've referred to what I've mentioned in the introduction of my presentation, the professions. The profession is here linked to public policy. Public policy is linked here to the government measures that would alleviate this catastrophic health crisis. So, how can we explain that in a situation that everything is solved, the religious knowledge haven't been able to reach a situation of discussion in order to be taken into account in the fight of the pandemic? So the profession is another word. My question is, can the profession, here the health profession, be an agent for national or transnational social transformation that advance the public interest? Because, as you know, what is a profession at all? In the most elementary sense, professionalism is a set of institutions which permit the members of an occupation to make a living while controlling their own work. This is a position of privilege, as said Francis. The two most general ideas underlying professionalism are the belief that certain work is so specialized as to be inaccessible to those lacking the required training and experience, and the belief that it cannot be standardized, rationalized, and commodified. What this means is that the state, before the crisis, has given a powerful position to some kind of professionals to control their own work and to define the problem, the content of the problem, and the solution to this problem. If you take the example of health, the medical profession has acquired this status of professionals. That means that it is only the medical profession that can define health, that can define the need to alleviate health hazard and health risk. So, in this context where even the medical profession has not had the solution, is it appropriate? Is it in the public interest that they block, that they do not allow all the competing knowledge to reach the table of discussion? This is the very key challenges As I said, the professions have claimed in my country, particularly the medical professions, have claimed for self-regulation as the efficient condition for their advancement of the public interest. We argue that the assumption of self-regulation here, historically claimed and enjoyed by the profession for efficient promotion of their position of interest, has shaped the division of labor in the medical practice in colonial and post-colonial Burkina Faso in a way that this has defunctionalized the state regulatory oversight. The fact that the medical profession has gained this power, it has led to the state, the state authority that cannot take measure without the consent of the profession. And this is very important in the time of crisis. In time of crisis, do we have to wait for the profession to accept that new knowledge being put into the table to solve the problem? Or has the authority the power to overpass this claim and impose measures to try and solve the problem? This is really a contentious question that goes back to the beginning of the social sciences, because as you see here, MIPS, the father of economics, Smith, said that how to make it possible for people to make their contribution to the social product as large as possible. And he suggested that the individual man would make this contribution as long as he pursued his own interest in his own way up in the liberal plan of equality, reliability, and justice. It means that we do not need a powerful profession to oversee how things have to be solved in the context. And for Smith, we need to open up competition, a positive competition, so that those people who have the best means will win, because in their own interest they want a play in the advantage of the public. Because if they play in the disadvantage of the public, they will lose their source of income. That is the next position. But from Durkheim, who is also the father of sociology, he said that Mips' thesis is very contentious, because the state must permit, according to Durkheim, the state must permit all those secondary groups of family, trade, and professional associations, church, regional areas, and so on, which then absorb the personality of their members. It must do this in order to prevent this absorption and free these individuals so as to remind them partial to society, and that they are not alone, and that there is a right that stands above their own right. The state must therefore enter into their right. It must supervise and keep a check on the way they operate. And to do this, it must spread its root in all directions. For this task, it cannot just withdraw into the tribunals. It must be present in all spheres of social life and make itself felt. Wherever this particular collective force exists, there the power of state must be to neutralize them, or if they were left alone and to their own device, they would withdraw the individual with their exclusive domination. This is Durkheim's thesis about professional group. So it's very interesting to see these opposing, a stance around the motives or the status of professional group like the downside. Smith said, no, leave them free. The competition will bring to public interest. Draken said, no, the state should be there and give the direction where to go. These are because for Draken, it's not possible for a social function to exist without moral discipline. Otherwise, nothing remains but individual appetites, and since they are by nature boundless and insatiable, if there is nothing to control them, they will not be able to control themselves. So, for Draken, professions should be overseen by the state authority in order for each time that the public interest is threatened, so that the state can take the best direction for the professions, for the public. So it's very important to note these opposing ideas, because if you look at the logic of professionalism is really against change. If you take, for example, the profession claim for outcomes that is in the interest of the public. But if you see the nature of professionalism, there is little that allow innovation. There's little that allow change. There's little that allows contingencies. For example, if you look at the notion of professional, the epistemological status of professional-based decision, it requires always the rational use of knowledge in professional decision making. That's good, but it is also from the social status of professional decision. It is also a body of knowledge and the condition with which it is applied that make professional decision rational. If you look at the character of professional knowledge, they are always disciplined knowledge. They are always, and we look at the professional status in the society. The professional status is in the society, it is, like the advisor, like the key pillar in the modern society. For example, state authority cannot decide if they do not resort to professional knowledge. It means that professions are very powerful in modern society. And really, if you look at the nature of how professional organization is functioning, they tend just to organize themselves in the interest of their members, if they claim for the public interest in the operation. But the logic of profession is the opposite side of the logic of innovation. Because in the context of crisis, where we need innovation, we need contingent measures, we need to reflect from everywhere. This is innovation. The logic of innovation, as opposed to the logic of professionalism, is more aligned with the context of crisis. Because if you look at the nature of innovation, innovation is a process of change, a parent movement. It is about the way through which new things are attributed, used in the social configuration. If you also look at the epistemological basis of innovation, innovator decision making, they do not use always formal knowledge. They use knowledge that is contextualized, knowledge, some kind of bricolage to reach the new solution. So the epistemological status of innovators' decision making is opposed to professional decision making. If you consider also the nature of innovation, the nature, the character of professional knowledge, you can see that innovators are using, knowledge that is not routinized, that is not formalized, and this is that's why they can, invent things. They can allow some resistance, some bottlenecks through their ways. in the social structure, the innovator hasn't had this powerful position like a professional, even though a professional can be innovator. If he is playing in the context of innovation, he has to live out the logic of professionalism. So, this is a summary of the two logics. You see that professionalism, like innovation, they intend the same outcome. That is to the improvements of the context of life, of well-being of the population. They have the same ends, but for the rest of the characteristics, they are different. The nature of professionalism is different from the nature of innovation. Epistemological status of professionalism is different, and so forth and so on. And that means that these are case studies. If I've done during the last 3 years, in order to test this claim of professions, to be left alone to govern themselves for the public interest. For example, if you take the African Union's Transformation Program, the member states have allowed the academic professions to organize this program in order to develop indigenous solution to African health problem. But I can tell you that the result of this study showed that on the long run, the program, which is meant to be multidisciplinary, on the long run, you have 100% of pharmacists who take roles on the program. You see, the member states have bestowed this power on the ground that if left alone, specialist professions can act on the basis of truth, on the basis of science for the public interest. But you see that for something that would have, gathered all the discipline, on the long run, a group of professionals have captured the program for their own interest. And so we can say that today this program is a failure because it hasn't been able to gather all the traditional healers, social sciences, medical sciences, pharmacists, and so forth and so on. You can see that it's dominated by pharmacists. Why? They have simply captured the program because there is no oversight that can deal with the behavior. If you have also did some studies on the WHO's mental health gap policy, if you look at this and how it's appropriated in each country, you see that, for example, in Burkina Faso, mental health has been the premise of traditional healers. Very few, orthodox medical profession, practice around this problem. But as soon as you see the money coming from the funders, you see this tiny group of professionals claiming that they're going to teach traditional healers how to solve mental health problem. Can you see how arrogant are the professions? You have been here, you are not doing the job, and people are doing the job very, relatively well. And as soon as the state, have some policy for improving mental health, you step on and you say that those who have been doing the job are not good. You are going to teach them now how to do the job. You see, it is not for me. The profession cannot be left alone. And this can lead us to the points I would like to make this afternoon, the state of emergency and its impact on all the phenomena in the state. If you look at the law that regulates the state of siege and the state of emergency in Burkina, which has been passed in 2019, you have all these points. All these powers bestowed to the authority, to civilian authority, because you have the state of affairs and the state of emergency. The difference is that the state of emergency is led by the civilian, whereas the state of affairs is led by military. But the content, the powers are the same. Impress people who themselves prohibit the movement of people, order search, and impress force arm, order deposits of arm and ammunition, control media content, control and prohibits any teaching, sermon, program, or activity inciting violence, hatred, and so on, house arrest, suspend or dissolve any group or association. State of emergency is state of full power. Why? My question is, why during this COVID context, the state hasn't, taken back the powers of professions in order to use all the measures available to tackle the problem of COVID? This is a question that, I've been looking for answers. But because this is a factor of ideas, I throw out these ideas to you so that we together look for the answers. What is the status of expertise or knowledge in this law? Normally, this law covers everything, including any group, any professional group. The authority can, on the sake of the public interest, on the sake of others, they can suspend, they can impress them to do things for the public interest. You see that when I consider the context of COVID, you have the traditional healers, who were really ready to contribute, and you have the medical profession that said, no, don't leave these people. They're going to kill all people, and they're going to do malpractice, and so forth and so on. But in a context where there is no solution, why cannot you, allow? Because if they are really 40 people, they have been, they would have disappeared for a long time. And I really, was wondering why the state cannot use these powers in emergency context in order to allow innovation, as I showed it earlier, to allow that marginal ideas come, to the top for discussion, for testing, for, in order to find the solution for the public interest. For on the sake of professional corporate interests, the state would not allow other people engaged in contributing to this, if not just to sensitize people, just to educate people. But there are also creative measures. But the profession would not allow it. The profession was against it. But this is the key issue really from that I would like to end with this key this presentation is that we can see some of the bottlenecks to public action are related to policy and expertise related to decision making, because the fact that the modern state relies on science and expertise from the scientific profession, and here the medical profession, it has been blocked for action. And because the state has bestowed them on the power to decide what is helping, what is not helping, what is measured, and what is not a good measure, we find our state blocked, in the context where they should have sought every means to alleviate difficulties and issues. The state of emergency, I can see, can offer an opportunity for change for the public interest. Example, where there is no explicit provision in the law that allows decision makers to choose this alternative knowledge and knowledge source for public action. example, if you look at the law, there is no explicit, there is no explicit, although it is round up in the broad world, you cannot see that power, and maybe it is because of that the profession has been dominant. The profession has been at the forefront in blocking, in impeding the contribution of other alternative solutions. So for society like ours, for society dominated like ours, this situation provides instead the opportunity for powerful countries, to reinforce their influence on the forum. We have seen in Madagascar, we have seen, where, even with the goodwill of the president, you see pressure coming from everywhere. You see pressure coming from the WHO. You see pressure coming from the other countries that say that the medicine, promoted by the president is fake medicine. Everything to disqualify these alternative medicines. But in the state of emergency, I can see that the state has some powers to use every means for really new measures. Why in our context this has not happened are related to the profession, and I am really arguing that the professions, whether learned or not, should not always left alone for deciding, because expertise is not related to choices in terms of policy, because professions can contribute, but they cannot be left alone to decide on the full range of things that should be done to solve the problem. It is in the joint discussion that profession can, play its role as a change maker and not the corporate jurisdictional, protector. Thank you very much, and it will be a pleasure to answer the questions, and also really learn from you, because I know that Latin America is really this kind of discussion, and I'm very grateful for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saladogo. We are really great that you presenting your lecture. I'm also going to ask you to when we do the ask questions and ask questions, we open the question box, that you turn you bring your microphone for closer to you, so we can listen to you in a better way, because it was with so much echo and so much noise entering the microphone that we had a little trouble trying to understand you. But in every way, thank you. Professor João.
Sir João. Professor, can you hear me? I'm going to translate this lecture to English. Have you accessed the translation channel? I'm going to introduce Professor Manuel Oliveira, who's got a doctoral degree at the University of Santa Catarina. He works with on gender and critical studies of sexuality and feminist theory. He understands performance of gender within a feminist epistemology, post-structuralist. In his publications, he deals with intersectionalities and hyphenization, homo-heteronormativity, knowledges, subjugated knowledges in eccentric genealogies, feminist anti-racist theories, and anti-sensualist theories. Queer theory studies
as relações intrincadas entre
the relationships that are intricate in terms of bodies and policies
políticas
and
neoliberais.
economies.
Atualmente, ele é professor
Currently, he is visiting
no Instituto Universitário de Lisboa, onde é professor nos programas doutorais em Psicologia e Psicologia Social. É investigador integrado no CIS, o Instituto Universitário de Lisboa. Seja muito bem-vindo, professor João.
Então, posso começar. Muito obrigado. Estão me ouvindo bem? Só para fazer uma explicação inicial. Eu queria começar por agradecer o convite.
I would like to start by thank you for this invitation. It's very good, and I would like to thank Professor Jamile and Professor Lívio. Isso é porque
Acho que talvez alguém esteja com o microfone ligado. William, você pode só verificar? Porque
a equipe precisa desabilitar aí o dele.
Professor Salvador,
Natewini, would you please switch off your microphone? Já falo.
Ok. Então, queria começar precisamente...
Natewini, if you want to listen to the translation, you should click on English. Next to, go down your screen, there is lower hand, record languages, and click into English. Okay?
Okay, excuse me, Professor, and after this, I'm going to ask you to turn off your video, because we needed the video of the Professor João Manuel in full screen. Okay? Professor Salvador, did you hear me? Excuse me, I was asking you to please to turn off your video, because we needed to put Professor João in full screen. Thank you. Desculpa, Professor João. Pode continuar,
Ele
por
já acessou a
gentileza.
tradução? Sim, sim. Sim, sim, não se preocupe. Vamos para frente, por favor.
Então,
Yes.
retomando, queria agradecer...
Going back, I would like to thank for the invitation of being here today. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with this doctoral school, Fabricadeideias. And I am trying to bring some thoughts about work directly with this issue, but I have just edited a number in a magazine that is about to be released about biopolitics and COVID. And the magazine is the magazine of political psychology. And we were able to gather up works from several people thinking about this dimension, this biopolitical dimension. And I would like to bring a bit of that, and I would like to bring some notes. It's not something that is finished off yet. It's an ongoing thinking process. It's some notes about the cosmopolitics of COVID, because looking at a concept by Isabel Standards, I would like to start by locating and using Dana Harrow, biology is politics through other means. And we are going to start here. As it's been stated, I've been working about feminist theory, and my understanding of COVID-19 is going to be marked by that. And I would also like to situate a dispute that is taking place in several countries all over the world among critical forms of thinking about the world and thinking about politics from a right-wing vision or perception that has been broadly, that was able to acquire or very relevant position in world politics through the time period in which Donald Trump was in power in the United States. And people like Steve Bannon, who traveled all over the world, aggregating and joining parties that had no, in Europe, for example, that had no political representativeness or power, and through public funding and through learnings about how to wage a cultural war, started to become more and more powerful, important players in then I would like to start by locating a little bit this issue of fake news vis-a-vis this cultural wars for the outright that we could actually translate as right-wing policies that are trying to establish identity politics geared towards just the interests of white masculinity. So starting to look at the title of what's been proposed to me, this is where I'm going to locate myself. On the other hand, I'm also trying to bring classical ways of thinking about what fake news can do and the contemporary impacts of these fake news. I'm going to use classic social psychology material in understanding in terms of communication, but also within the perspective of profound changes, even in terms of what is considered truth. And in terms of a real social consensus, we are going to have several pressures exerted by these people as well. So at a certain, these models in terms of thinking about communication do not help us because they are decontextualizing what's been proposed in by these groups. On the other hand, also, I would like to bring some strategies in terms of thinking about the constitution of all the histories and possibilities that we may have in reflecting about what's happening, what's currently happening. So taking back Haraway, I'm going to be talking about COVID, but I'm using COVID rather as a metaphor to think about the political and to think about politics per se, using the differentiation that we have in terms what's politics and what's political and what has to do with how the extreme right-wing extremists in the 50s, they deepen that perspective in several ways. They don't have only one way of operating. We may encompass in this right-wing thinking the struggles against the so-called gender ideologies that they use in order to transform what has been achieved by feminism in issues that have been contested as though it's just an ideology. So we are speaking here about a strength that is not only one, and these are several forces, and we call them as strategies. They are taking place in several planes, both in religious. In Brazil, we have the tendency of thinking and dealing with issues of conservadorism from a religious standpoint, but this proximity to religion is not central they attack in several fronts, and one of the fronts is, in the European case, is science, including establishing creation of institutes and universities that may disseminate these ideas. I'm thinking about Hungary that is starting this type of process. So we are already, the universities also have never been only spaces for ideological uniformity. This notion has been actually sponsored since the universities all had, and they are going to use horrible ideas such as the universities have always hidden conservative, racist, sexist forces. Racism has been alive and well and evident in many of these cases, and since they constitute ecosystems of thought, of right-wing thought. Think about the role, for example, that the Chicago University is going to have in disseminating neoliberalism. These issues are issues that are, of course, these same universities having people who were openly against it. So we are talking about more and more complex systems. So in this cultural war, in the case of COVID, is going to be introduced as the right to not being vaccinated, the right of the states not necessarily buying, purchasing vaccines, and the issues of vaccination are going to be handled as an attack to an individual right of a free individual, an attack that is portrayed by the state, which is basically an oppressive state and a free individual. So we have this rationalism, Cartesian rationalism, that is applied in very acritical ways and thinking about this opposition, free individual and tyrannic states. If you were to think about several right-wing movements, this notion is always being equated, and it corresponds also to a desire of taking away from the state fundamental areas such as the issues of healthcare and education, and an encouragement so that the market forces become central. So differently from several authors that saw COVID and the pandemics as a form, as a way of almost as though the impact of the pandemic was going to be an attack to capitalism. And I think that these forces are here to guarantee that capitalism is going to be strengthened, and a capitalism that is more and more marked by issues. It's a capitalism that is not uniform, that is not going to occur and this is the main condition for success. It's global adaptability to the local. Looking already at the issues of fake news, one thing that seems to be interesting to think about is that it corresponds to in how it becomes scientific research, because this is the reference that many fake news starts with this. A study proved that, a research demonstrated that. It seems like there is a rhetoric that is linked to modern science. But obviously the use of this rhetoric is not it is not the same as production of modern science, because when we talk about the fact that there's been a research, it's because they have consulted some videos on YouTube. And this researches are based on groups that are linked to ways of producing knowledge that are not the classic ones that admitted in terms of methodological approaches. The flat earth theory has been demonstrated to be an interesting case study for Brazil. And there are people who are actually claiming to be developing research. But flat earth is not only a case of arguments in Brazil. And we had someone who got a boat, and then we have this meme in which they actually got lost right in the beginning of the Mediterranean, and then if they used a compass, and how would you use a compass if the earth was plane? But then they didn't even know how to use the compass, and they got lost in the Mediterranean. So we are here talking about a notion that works in the sense of replacing or trying to replace and use this rhetoric of science. And here we have several groups. The event I'm thinking about anti-vaxxers, and who are always linking things that happen. For example, in the case of some vaccines, we are going to present the vaccines to children and they are going to develop autism. They are going to develop this and that. So the attempts to limit and try to block these uses. A recent case that's been mentioned here in the Brazilian press, YouTubers who were paid in order to offer wrong information about vaccinations. And there are proliferations, therefore, of opinions in terms of these demonstrations. So we are currently living a moment in which this logic of opinion seems to be above a scientific logic. Not that I think that science doesn't have anything to do with that. I think that science of creating a rhetoric of hegemonic theory, it has opened then above all a notion of certainty that does not belong to the logic of producing science. The logic is much more about doubts and more than sequencing. The classic studies about that have produced some interesting works in thinking about these issues. For example, a classic study of 1956 of Henry Ricken, Leonce Festinger, and Stanley Chester, who provided a study talking about when the prophecy fails. And it's interesting to think about some issues in which their theories and beliefs are not able to. We are studying a case of a religious group because they thought the world is not going to end, and then how are we going to adequate their beliefs to a fact that hasn't happened? And then in this religious group that expected the world to end, and what happens is an attempt by the group to use that in their favor. And I think that actually occurs in some of these groups. What happens is that these groups are going to have what we call a readjustment of beliefs. The world hasn't ended because we have prayed so much and we are so good that we have prevented the end of the world. And this is going to value the group and have this group become seeing themselves in more positive ways. And this is going to fall into what Festinger calls the theory of cognitive dissonance, the reduction of dissonant elements. And this is a state of comfort in which someone, the more consonant elements they have in their beliefs, the better they're going to feel. And the other way around as well. But what these issues, this theory does not address issues of the political aspects of this work. And in 72, I'm bringing some of the classics of psychology that helps us think in terms of social psychology. And this is the work that was published in books called Victims of Group Thinking of Irving Janus, in which he talks about an analysis of the management of the invasion of the Bay that was invaded by the United States, in which the United States was unable to take this decision ahead. And Irving Janus studies this issue in terms of what happens within this group that are making decisions in order to have this impact. And he talks about a pressure for a uniform thinking, a pressure to provide consensus that is going to be established around notions such as beliefs that were in question, the use of thinking stereotypes, self-censorship, illusions of vulnerability, and direct pressure. And that would be linked to an identity of this group that was going to influence and have an impact in the influence of the so-called charismatic leaders. And it's not by chance that normally these figures linked to the right-wing forces are presented as messiah figures that come to save the country and the world from corruption and bring a new way of positioning ourselves in the world, and that come to save us. And the so-called salvationists and factors that contribute to that elevated cohesion of these groups, we see that one of the issues that I have been finding interesting is that it doesn't matter the number of deaths, it doesn't matter the number of people who are being harmed directly by COVID. It doesn't matter the economic damage, the mismanagement, the group will remain loyal to their leaders. This is an issue that we see in Brazil in very impressive ways. The issue of situational factors and structural factors that has to do with a certain inefficiency of the group itself. But interestingly, in many cases, this inefficiency from the part of the government in managing a crisis of this magnitude is not enough to have any real impact in popularity. But we don't have a moment in which there's an absolute rupture. At least we haven't reached that point yet. So this
Questão da comunicação.
interesting because, however, they don't help us think about the political.
Como um campo de disputa do político, o que é visto como verdadeiro e como a gente tem coisas a serem faladas, a serem discutidas, que traduzem a própria descredibilização da ideia de verdade.
Translate this notion of truth. Then we are dealing with forms of thinking and positioning oneself that bring complexity to the establishment of epistemic frontiers between what's truth and what's not truth. And it implies then that we need to understand the issue of truth and the dispute of truth as a field, an epistemological dispute as a field of political disputes, because the extreme right is not interested in thinking about this agonistic notion of democracy, this notion of conflict that exists in democracy, that in its foundation, as Chantal Mouffe would state, in reality, right wings are subscribed to adversarial vision about politics, of a version in which it's necessary to eliminate the adversaries. Recent declarations of a candidate for City Hall in Armadura, a right-wing candidate, obviously, who came to state that her notion of exterminate the left-wing bloc. The use of these metaphors is very ambivalent, and then she comes and states that she didn't mean to exterminate anybody, but the use of this metaphor is very recurring in the case of right wings. We should not forget that during elections, American elections, in North American elections in which Trump wins, in which the people are screaming, lock her up, lock her up, lock Hillary up. So this encouragement, particularly adversarial, it's not to think that there is a conflict with me. The other is in an antagonist. It is someone who needs to be eliminated so that my vision, my true vision may be established. And then I bring some notions that should be debated here, bringing the issue of cosmopolitics, which is a way of thinking in broad terms, and thinking some models that are a bit more complex in playing with local and global scales, and thinking about multi-level interactions in these scales. If we were to look at the issue of the production of this fake news and the production of what is the pandemic, such as COVID, we should also think about the issue of the ecological crisis. And when I talk about the ecological crisis, I'm talking about the changes made by people in all terrestrial ecosystems. And we could then talk and think about what is anthropocentrical, because it's an interesting idea, but Jason Moore and Donna Haraway don't come to us in thinking about these impacts, because not all the globe and all humans contribute in the same ways. See, for example, this in terms of carbon emission from several countries, the degrees of carbon emissions in the United States vis-a-vis an African country. It's not the same scale, and therefore we could not do what has been these attempts of that it's a problem for the same problem for everybody. And the issue then is of not being possible here in terms of thinking about a similar answer. Not all countries have the same ways of providing answers to this crisis. On the other hand, one thing that I think is very interesting to think about is that we should not, as Donna Haraway states, we should not thinking about virus as invaders, because they departed from our body. We are then talking about the species that are in some way a part of our process of evolution, of co-evolution, if you will. Then we will have here a number of impacts in terms of the ways we think about not only the pandemics work, but also how these conceptions about the immune system, for example, the fact that if we continue to use this war metaphor to think about the immune system as a system that has been invaded by external force, while we are looking at the immune system rather as a system of processing information. These war metaphors do not help us understand the case COVID. Rather, they're going to be used as a point to imagine and think, particularly by right wings, several issues. For example, this notion of the body as a fortress being invaded by a virus. Wouldn't it be similar to this notion of an European fortress being invaded by immigrants, and then this European identity is placed, for example, neo-fascist German groups that bring AFD, for example, that bring this notion as a central notion of the threat to ways of being European. Another issue has to do with the pressures of citizens and the management of their discontent and how it's managed in, for example, in Madrid. In Madrid, the answer is governed by the right. They responded to this discontent with confinement, with measures that increased rates, but they are able then to be re-elected with more votes. So once again, there's no linear relationship here between, for example, a more elevated number of deaths and the issue of re-elections. Because what we are going to have here is a differentiation in terms of this distribution of the precariousness vis-a-vis COVID. We are going to have more Black people being affected by COVID, more women and more impoverished people. And of course, for these people who have voted to the right wing, these lives that do not matter. These are lives upon which we should, they are not cryable, if you will. So a good bandit is a bad bandit. So obviously there's also an extreme right. There's this very strong criminalization of poverty. On the other hand, we are also going to have, in conclusion, ways in which the press organizes itself in order to be able to capitalize over fake news. So the conventional press itself is going to start to use this logic of clickbait that are going to be using this news in order to provide more funding for publicity, and this clickbait is going to generate sentences that are very appealing, that do not help in thinking in rational ways. And on the opposite, they feed this imagination, or this imaginary rather, of right-wing forces. And in sharing a bit of this logic, we are standing vis-a-vis what Charles Bolsonbeck is calling a dramaturgic epidemic, which I rather call a plot that goes from individuals to collective forces, converging in a particular space and spreading in others, and bringing growing tensions vis-a-vis a climax. And this political dimension is a fundamental part of this plot. So in fact, we are then dealing with a process of counter narratives that need to be interrupted. And in fact, from the several factors I'm pointing out, the right wings have become a fundamental aspect of this narrative. So we need to find ways of telling other stories and producing other ways of building these arguments and ways of considering these pandemics. I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor João, pela sua generosa partilha.
Thank you, Professor João, for your generous sharing. We are going to have a 5-minute break now so that we can, and then we'll be back in 5 exact minutes, 11:43 local time, and stay tuned and send your questions.
Você está sem áudio, William?
Eu estava cantarolando.
Ah, tá.
Olá, pessoal, estamos voltando, retornando às nossas atividades desse encontro Fábrica de Ideias, lembrando sempre que para serem certificados, todos devem assinar a lista, né? E ter até 75% de frequência. A lista vai ser liberada nos 30 últimos minutos da conferência e vai ficar disponível até 30 minutos depois que a conferência se encerrar, tá? Então, é isto. Voltamos já. Só peço mais um minuto, que aí vamos retornar, vamos passar a palavra para a professora Jamile, mas antes disso, vou aguardar o outro canal. Prontinho, a professora Raquel retornou. Eu queria...
He was once again mentioning issues related to the attendance sheet.
A doutora Jamile Borges,
And now we are going to have Dr. Jamile Borges, who is a doctor by the Lisbon University. She's a permanent member and coordinator of the Graduate Studies in Ethnic African Studies at POSAFRO. She's the editor of the Afro-Asian Studies magazine. She's got a degree in social sciences by UFBA, bachelor and master in education by UFBA. She's a doctor in anthropology and ethnic studies and African studies. She's an adjunct professor of the Federal University of Bahia, and she teaches in several institutions of higher learning. She's a researcher at the Interdisciplinary Studies, the Decolonial Studies, housed in the Center for Multidisciplinary Education in the School of Humanities at the University of Mar del Plata. She develops research at SEAL in Africa, Guiné-Bissau, Cabo Verde, Cape Verde, and Mozambique. And she's a permanent member at the coordination of the Factory of Ideas, and she develops research in anthropology and museums and training in and museums in transcultural context. She's got projects in digital museums, coordinating the Afro Digital Museum in partnership with UERJ, UFBA, UFMG-S. She's got an experience in communication, in sociology, and contemporary, particularly in the fields
imagem e memória, africanidade e identidade cultural. Seja muito bem-vinda, professora Jamile.
Olá, espero que me ouçam bem. Eu quero agradecer aos nossos convidados dessa sessão. Quero agradecer a todas as pessoas que assistem essa sessão em nossos canais de transmissão, também no YouTube. Eu quero fazer um agradecimento também especial aqui à Raquel, que tem sido a nossa tradutora, né, desde que nós começamos nas sessões...
Um momento, a professora Raquel está com o microfone desligado.
we have started. I would like to provide an acknowledgement to all of those who have been following our lectures.
Pronto. Então, eu quero agradecer também a Raquel, que tem participado conosco, né, nesse esforço.
I would like to thank Raquel for having supported us.
Nesse formato remoto.
We are organizing this remote Factory of Ideas format, but the experience last year, an experience from the intellectual standpoint, it was very interesting. Though obviously our hope is that we may go back to our presential format soon. the professor from Burkina Faso approached issues of innovation, technological innovations, and a little bit about the debate on confrontation and the fact that these technological advancements have been producing in terms of the readings and interpretation and the modes, reading modes of the contemporary scene in Burkina Faso in dealing with issues of the pandemic. And we know that the African continent, in fact, has a history of dealing with these pandemics, and therefore the answers have been intriguing for researchers, epidemiologists. We should be reminded that he shows in his slides that the first case in Burkina Faso is only narrated in 1 year later. The first case is in Wuhan, China, and I think that he brings very interesting data in trying to understand the relationship between the development of public policies and the participation of several professions and people in dealing with both technological innovations as well as those who develop professional, be it in combating the pandemics as well as other innovations. He is a very dear friend, and his texts have been reflection about themes that are very dear to us. Public policies, issues of gender, anti-racist interventions. Someone who's always attentive to the impacts of this heteropatriarchic capitalism and the impacts in political and intellectual context. And therefore, the presence of these two colleagues honors us because it broadens our reflections and brings new themes for this second cycle, which is a kind of unfolding of the themes we were developing last year, thinking about biopolitics and cosmopolitan approaches as proposed by Professor João Manuel. So I would like to provide some considerations around this theme of pandemics last year. It's been a focus of my research. I've been stating that sometimes the writing around the pandemics has been a cathartic exercise in ways of trying dealing with these losses and all the mournings. It's been stated that one person alone cannot change things, and one virus is not going to produce epidemics. And the times of pandemics have been revealing a profound abyss in terms of socioeconomic inequalities, but also inequalities, and the theme of racism and anti-racism, and the links with multiple phases of the pandemic has been very interesting to us. And I think that it's important to realize that in the midst of this chaos, nothing anchors us more in places of certainties, and everything has been leading us to spaces and algorithms that predict our death rates, and the numbers have been pointing out to futures that are very shadowy. Susan Watkins states, what would be the political wounds and causes of the crisis, and how can we offer alternatives and explaining that the pandemics have exposed the incompetence of populist leaders the advancement of the extreme right and the ways they have been dealing with these preferential governmental channels
para solapar a pesquisa, a ciência, né? A difusão, inclusive, né, de temas como terraplanismo,
boycott research, ideas such as Earth,
a credibilidade das instituições
and also attacking the credibility of intellectuals, researchers, and institutions. So the text then states that reflecting about the impacts of the pandemics has to do with how we position ourselves in these pandemics. These interventions, these ethic committed interventions, and perhaps this should be one of the moments in the history of humanity in which public intellectuals, we should then be engaged with the exercise of critiquing and denouncing. We are talking about true intellectuals who are committed to ways of producing knowledge amongst institutions, media, society, and the thinking about identity politics, fake news, and COVID implies looking for ethic ways of dealing with these histories of the people who have been subjected to losses in this traumatic and painful global event, which is the pandemic. And anthropologists who have been researching in terms of theory of the Zika and chikungunya epidemics, and he states that these pandemics, they are not only depicting epidemiological circumstances, but they need to be read in terms of the biopolitical impact to society, serves to reorganize issues. And it's interesting to see that there's a issue, for example, not only around the ways through which vaccinations are distributed and the ways priorities are distributed in the dynamics of the vaccine distribution, but also an ethnic issue in terms of how the wealthiest people have been leaving the country in order to be vaccinated, in how these socioeconomic abysses have been revealed since the first cases of the pandemics in the middle class that circulates and had actually brought this virus to Brazil, and the first victims were domestic workers, Black domestic workers. So there's a number of norms and subjectivities in politics of coexistence that should be reflected upon in pandemic circumstances. As when we had the news in January 2020 that the virus was causing respiratory syndrome deaths, we were breathing very politically dense environment, and there was this fog that made our horizons very difficult in a country that had been recently affected coup d'etat, in which a woman president was entering and preparing for her second term, in which they was an announcement of this mental of social promotion, but also in promoting racial equity. And Professor João Manuel talked about how the associations between this debate of free individuals and the tyrannic states still reveals this struggle of a portion of society where we live that we here call as the elites, perhaps that shouldn't be the most adequate term, but this elite that seeks to withdraw the state for the entry of the market.
Que poderia articular a busca pela vacina, né, se articulou ao discurso do negacionismo, ao
These are the people who were articulating discourses of anti-vaccination and who are now leaving the country in order to be vaccinated elsewhere, demonstrating these multiple dimensions of confronting the pandemics. As we search best tame these pandemics of Zika, dengue, and chikungunya that have caused, we thought that these epidemiological scenarios were only affecting impoverished populations. The COVID pandemics demonstrates that nobody is immune. And it may be read here as an analytical tool of great importance. Nobody was immune to coronavirus in the same ways that societies are not prepared to deal with the progressive advancement and dismantlement of public policies. Even those people who are in instances of socioeconomic instances and corporations, and they have been feeling the impact of the dismantlement of public and socioeconomic policies that have actually made, with a few economic issues, it was visible that several social strata were benefiting from these policies of income transference. Débora Diniz was also an intellectual that I respect, who has expelled from Brazil in light of the threats she was receiving. She's been arguing that the coronavirus pandemic seems to be an updating of Foucault classes about biopolitics, security, and territory. And in our governments have been producing control and vigilance over our bodies. We have seen that in Professor Salvador in the advancement of technological innovations around dealing with the pandemic, and I dealt with that in the Factory of Ideas in 2020, relationship between pandemics, algorithms, and datacracy, softwares for biomedical control and temperature control, oximetry. Oximeters have been sold more than ever, and the first equipment that came to the drugstores then were started at 500 reais, and this drop in prices reveals several things. I'm not going to talk about the economic aspect of these issues, but the ways through which we started to incorporate not only these innovations, but a whole vocabulary that has been produced around the pandemics. Lockdown, oxygenization, Leviathan sanitary confinement, distancing, masks, PFF2, a whole grammar, a whole new grammar that has been produced around the pandemics, and people from different social economic strata has been incorporating, though the large majority of them are not able to define its meaning, but they live this meaning of this vocabulary in their daily lives, and they know exactly what it means from the standpoint of the impact on our bodies. So this regime of control and vigilance that is produced over us under the argument of the policies of sanitary policies. So When we enter in a metro station and our data is read, we are authorized. We authorize what's been called, because we don't have ways of arguing against that. I don't want this camera to read my temperature. I'm not able to demand this biomedical reading. So there are a number of ethical issues involved, as what Professor Manuel calls this new biopolitics, but also when he reminds us, Dana Haraway, stating that biology is politics. There's a whole debate around the multi-species anthropologists thinking about the ways through which societies have been directly affected by this kind of that is only visible through being in which this debate, we need to relearn how to produce perhaps not only new tools, intellectual tools, but also new strategies, methodological strategies in order to understand societies in which these interactions may signal some strategies, some possibilities in these policies of coexistence. In the case of epidemics and the pandemics, there is what I have been calling this epidemiological singularities. I've just produced a text that has been recently published, in which I deal with what I called the sensible heritage of pain, particularly for more vulnerable populations, how the memories of these people are going to be handled and depicted, particularly in the different spaces of production of what's been called digital and or memorials. So these epidemiological and cultural singularities go beyond the microbiological aspect of things. It's more and more about biopolitics. It's also a new term, particularly for those who are in the field of museums and the interface in terms of thinking about the legacy of biopolitics of this country for the new generations. And perhaps that should be more important than finding out what is the conspiracy theory that should be more relevant to debate this video. So the impacts of this pandemics is not a simple task. There are a number of moral issues, a number of political, sanitary issues that emerge and that need to be redimensioned. For example, these reflections about the post-truth place in the order of the day issues about authorship, legitimacy, circulation, training, knowledge, memory, ethics, archives, but above all, racisms, new forms of racism and its intersections. The pandemics may be read both in its more strict sense, but also thought about in terms of intellectual abstractions that should be dealt with in terms of descriptive ethnographic exercises, psychological exercises, historiographical exercises around sensible politics instead of only exalting the metrics and the indexes, the rates around deaths and exponential rates for contamination. We should talk about professional activities and some information that are quantifiable, but above all, that escape, I would say, aspects related to infodemics and purely mathematic aspects. Fulfilling the data, therefore, beyond what may not be quantifiable, accounting for these multiple senses and retrieving these trajectories. Dealing then with these pandemics in terms of the numbers, in terms of data, as though it should be also be an expression, a real expression, a painful expression of the politics and the necropolitics in terms of how our countries all over the world, particularly Brazil, have adopted, have been dealing with the lives of people. And hence, I would like to conclude my reflections so that we can have space for questions that see already emerging in the chat box. Thank you, Professor Jamili, for sharing for generously sharing your thoughts with us. We have then questions. I'd also like to note that in light of some connection issues, Professor Natewindi couldn't remain in this conversation, but he's going to be receiving questions through email. Professor João.
A gente tem duas perguntas aqui. Teve uma que foi enviada primeiramente pelo Denilson Lessa, que ele escreve: todos nós sabemos dos inúmeros benefícios das redes sociais e da tecnologia digital para a humanidade. A questão é como
We are all aware of the benefits of social media and technology for the good of humanity. Besides the positive aspects of social media, we have negationism, we have doctrinary impositions, intolerance, and miraculous recipes, and even for COVID-19, amongst other abject practices. Then, was Umberto Eco right when he stated that the social sciences have allowed for a legion of messiahs? What can we do then in terms of the promotion of the dangerous fake news producer as the one who bears the truth? And then I would like to bring the questions by Professor Livio, in which he states, talks about the popularity and the opinions / facts in corresponding to bourgeois struggles in the post political issues from this transition and writing and virtual writing, in which modernity then has another transition, the struggle between facts and versions of facts. Then I'm going to have both of you commenting on these questions. I would like to thank you for your generosity and for Jamili's analysis in terms of thinking about fostering reflection. I'm going to talk about two issues associated to what Jamili is stating, because I wanted to bring up a question that has to do with what Jamili is stating. What are the narratives and what are the forms that we have in recounting these pandemics without the datocracy? Because this is an extremely serious issue. I didn't address that, but as Jamile has, we are here at the facing the frameworks proposed by Foucault, biopolitics, and it's exactly in terms of fostering, telling other stories. I'm going to call them stories because it seems to be too complex. Then, for example, a project by a colleague that I thought was very interesting, Pablo Perez Navarro has organized a project in which he calls queer and trans people who talk about what has happened to them. It's a queer antenna. How do people who, from the standpoint of the order of gender, who position themselves outside of this established order or seen as such, we also have how do they produce? In terms of Afrofuturism, we have Afrofabulations, the issues of Saadia Hartman that could help us think about other possibilities of futures, because from this debris where we find ourselves, there are the needs to bring these archives as a very important part of the counter narratives against this datocracy, which is, in my view, part of the problem that Livio brings in his question. Because when we take in the issue of this transition, post-industrial and post-political, how can people not see politics? I think politics, on the other hand, it goes beyond the domains that are considered tradition in politics in order to interfere in all places at the same time as an outcome of neoliberalism. So I think that this neoliberal operator is going to have a fundamental role, because the grammatical politics of neoliberalism allows for the situation where we find ourselves in terms of these pandemics. In fact, dealing a little bit with what Jamile has addressed, we are not dealing with an issue of listening. We are dealing, on the other hand, with very broad issues of strengthening neoliberal forces to the extent that it's no longer recognized as neoliberalism. I think, therefore, that here, for example, we may think that eventually right wings then may occupy the space that many people, conservative people in the social sciences, used to call postmodernism, because we are dealing with cultural relativisms that comes to dispute the issue of truth that may be used in any old way, and bringing more pressure in what may be disconsidered as scientific research, because what matters is the political, and then we are at a stage in which we almost also could call baroque in political perspectives, that it's everywhere at the same time. And it's an issue that I think is happening. And for example, it's very interesting the ways in which they deal with other identities and social positions. They are dealt with identity representing what's human. So the appeal to the universals are interesting, but I believe that we take this big risk of not taking them seriously. And this expression by Umberto Eco about of a legion of imbeciles is not to take seriously what these discourses do,
Sociais é pouco
because
como
social media is like the world. You're going to have everything there. These things are, of course, going to bring more proximity amongst people. Social media is going to foster the dissemination of all kinds of ideas, and not only this one. So the fact that we are looking to social media as a space in which there's only that is also a conservative way of looking at social media, because my question is, what answers has the left provided? What are the answers provided by left-wing forces? Because we find some, but they don't seem to be convincing. They don't seem to be responding, seriously responding the challenges that are being placed. And this is being observed from electoral perspectives, because if we were to look at the global map, the extreme right is still strong and provoking moderate rights to use their political grammars, which is something that I find very worrisome in terms of this dispute of opinions and facts. I believe that we need to take on a more contingent rationality, because this is not only from the standpoint in which many things are introduced as facts that perhaps may be debated in not so encapsulated ways. The strategies in naming everything pseudoscience, a science that doesn't work, is also a way of opening the space for this type of debate. It is a way of stating, in my understanding, it's not for us to create epistemic rigid ways that we are going to solve this problem. It's bringing them in from some type of respect for their positions, because oftentimes what I see in terms of scientific understanding, science said and be contradicted, and I think that works against us, because science has to work from the notion of doubt. Vaccination, there's been a constitution of doubts that allowed for these solutions, but debating this issue also bringing a democratization of how people may use science. And I think that once again, we are standing before issues in terms of the use of science that may be used in several ways, including, for example, I have very great difficulties in accepting how the European Union continues to have a position about issues of that is so protectionist of pharmaceutical industry, and there's very little concern with the rights to protecting the health. It's almost like capitalist interests were above it all. So in many cases, the uses of science are even in terms of defending a vaccination campaign. I think that we have here these grammars of the pandemics, as Jamili states, that seems to be more in terms of launching confusion than bringing the conditions for an interesting debate. And one of the things that have been interesting in this debate is this coexistence politics. And a recent remark has been made about the people who were being more affected by the virus. That seems that the virus establishes the virus establishes a virus that existed in the bodies in people who died. This old virus that existed in the body has highest indexes than in the rest of the population. So perhaps it's not only one virus at work. that we are actually in an issue of an ecology of actors. And that's a bit of what I said. I wanted to state. I agree with you, and I would like to talk a little bit about an issue that has been drawing my attention, which has to do with both this understanding of pseudo and the notion of universals. Nós, we above all, we are being then flooded by what's universal. The universal in terms of confronting the virus and producing vaccines, in the ways of diffusing these strategies for vaccination. And when we know that if we don't think about local solutions, you won't be able to reach the results that are expected for understanding or preventing the advancement of this contagious rates. So from the perspective of anthropology, these new dichotomies they return in ways that are profoundly interesting from the standpoint so that we go back to this new space of what's universal, what's private, what is hegemonic, and what is counter-hegemonic. And I think that this is an interesting debate, and it has to do with the uses in access to spaces in social networks. It seems like they are governed by two orders of reason. One is the order of reason for those people who we consider.
Então, o Twitter é um exemplo bem claro disso, né? Eu, há um tempo, não usava o Twitter, voltei a usar depois do ano passado, do início da pandemia. Então, é claro que há ali uma espécie de establishment de pessoas.
So, of course, then, the people who write and bring and deal with the pandemics, many colleagues that who have very active
políticos, né? Então há uma série de pessoas que de alguma maneira buscam formular o que seriam essas narrativas hegemônicas sobre a pandemia, né? Então essa é uma ordem de razão, né? E a outra ordem de razão são as instituições, né? E aí as instituições, começando aqui, tanto as mídias, digamos, mais tradicionais, então o jornalismo, né? O Folha de São Paulo,
journalists and Folha de São Paulo, Estadão,
Fox News,
other big corporations, Fox News and BBC, in the pharmaceutical industries, we have never had such a close relationship in the sense with pharmaceutical industries. And talking directly with Pfizer, with Sinovac and other corporations, Fiocruz, Butantan, and that has generated and created a closeness to people in general with these institutions and research centers. And this is a new phenomenon, an important new phenomenon in thinking about the ways through which common people who are not part of these intellectual establishments may deal directly with these companies that bring this mediation in terms of combating the pandemics. And I think that these networks are undergoing a through phase for social analysts that have a lot of work to develop in the formulation, for example, of softwares for reading how the hashtags and these network indexes also orienting the debate. What is going to the headlines of the main newspapers in the world in general is being oriented by the social network bubbles. And we see colleagues that have been following that in the United States, in England, and in France, And we see how daily the main newspapers are directly affected by that. So we have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of understanding this phenomenon.
De fato, como diria o João,
And I think then that in fact, narrating this, because we are not only talking about efforts of reading society and people, but reading elements that create a mediation in this new phenomenon that it's actually also a phenomenon.
Muito obrigada, professora Jamila.
Thank you, Professor Jamile.
A gente atingimos o nosso teto aqui.
So we have reached
às 12h30.
our limit at 12:30. I would like to thank you, Prof,
Que nos acompanharam até aqui.
for all of those who have followed us till now, to thank Professor João for his brilliant explanation, Professor Saladogo, who could not continue to be here with us, to thank Professor Jamile Borges for this debate, to thank Raquel for her interpretation. We will be back next week, Tuesday, for another live of our Factory of Ideas cycle. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.